Welcome to this YSL DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series, we're going to talk about disconnected slicers. We'll begin with a description of what disconnected slicers are before we create one in a report. We'll explain how you can return the selected value and then use that to compare with other values in your measures. We'll show you how you can test if any values in the slicer are selected, and then talk about the difference between multiple selection versus single selection and how you can deal with each type. We'll explain how you can add an all option to single selection slicers, and then to finish the video, we'll talk about creating dynamic titles for the visuals that you display the results in. If you've been using Power BI Desktop for a while, you've almost certainly encountered the slicer visual. Normally, you'd use a slicer to filter the other visuals on the same page, as in this example where I can select a genre from my slicer, and that will then filter both the chart and the table below to show only the films in the genre that I've picked. But what if you didn't want to use a slicer to filter things? What if you wanted to use it simply to select a value that your measures could then make use of? If I have a look on the second page here, I've got a table set up in the middle which shows a list of genres along with their average runtimes, and then I've created a couple of measures which I'd like to use to compare the average runtime for each genre in the list with the average runtime of the genre I'd like to pick. I'm doing that by showing a variance from the selected genre and the percentage of the selected genre. If I try to select my genre using a regular slicer, as the slicer on the left is, I select a genre, but that simply filters the table to show me only the genre that I picked. If, however, I use this slicer on the right-hand side, which is a disconnected slicer, rather than filtering the table, it simply changes the value passed into each of my measures to calculate a different result, showing me how each genre compares to the one that I've picked. It's not just about tables, you can also show the same results in any other type of visual as well. If I head over to my third page here, comparing in a chart, again, my disconnected slicer allows me to pick a different genre, but my chart isn't filtered, it simply shows me all of the genres, and the bar reflects how the average runtime compares to the one that I've picked. So that's the sort of thing we'll have a look at creating in this video. Let's get started. To get started, I've already imported our standard list of movies from the Excel workbook to generate this list of tables in the data panel. As always, if you'd like to follow along with the video, I'll drop a link in the description below that you can use to download the Excel file and then simply import all the tables from it into the data model and you'll be ready to follow along. To begin, I'd like to add a table visual to this page, so let's insert a table, and then into that table I'm going to insert the genre field from the genre data table. I would then like to create a basic measure that calculates the average runtime of our films. So let's right-click on the All Measures table in the data panel, choose New Measure, and then if I just quickly zoom in a little bit, let's create a new measure called AVG Runtime. And we'll make this equal to the result of the average function, referring to the runtime minutes field in the film table. I've been enjoying working with the new color-coded brackets that have just been released this month in Power BI Desktop, making a bit of difference when you're trying to work out whether you've opened and closed all the brackets you need to. Anyway, at this point, if I press enter, that'll generate that measure. At this point, I can get rid of the delete me column of the all measures table. So let's just take the opportunity to do that. I'll right click on it and choose delete from model. And then I'll insert the average runtime measure into my table visual. Maybe just bump up the font size a little bit to make it a bit readable. And then there's the basic setup for this report. Next, I'd like to add a slicer to this page, which will allow me to select the genre whose average runtime I can then compare with all of the other genres. If I try to do that just using the original genre field, this clearly isn't going to work, but let's just make sure that that's true. Let's insert a slicer onto the page, and then add the same genre field we used to populate our table into the slicer. And then, of course, if I choose a genre from my slicer, the table will be filtered to show only the genre that I've picked. And of course it has to work that way. The two visuals are populated using the exact same field. It's natural that selecting the item in one visual would filter the other. If we want to make this work correctly, we need to have a version of the genre column that has no connection whatsoever to the original genre column of the genre table. There are several ways we could do that. One way would be to re-import the genre table from the Excel workbook a second time, and then give the new table a different name, and then we could populate our slicer with the second version of the genre table. We could also just choose to calculate a new table based on data that's already in our data model. So in fact, let's do that. I'm going to head up to the Modeling tab in the ribbon, and then in the Modeling tab, choose the New Table button. This allows you to write a DAX formula that can calculate and produce a brand new table. So I'm going to call my new table genre picker, and I'm going to make it equal to the result of the values function. And what the values function allows you to do is reference a column in your data model, and it will return a list of the unique, distinct values from that column. So we already know that the genre names are unique anyway, that's not that important. But if I reference the genre column of the original genre table, close the round brackets and hit enter, I will have calculated a brand new table with that genre column sitting in it. If I head over to my data view, or table view as it's now called, if I select my genre picker table, it's got an exact copy of all of the genre names, exactly the same as in the genre table originally. And if I have a look over in my data model, by clicking the model view button, the really important thing is that new table I've just created has no connection whatsoever to any other table in my data model. So if there's no connection between my genre picker and anything else, it means that selecting items in this table can't possibly propagate any filters to affect the results of any other tables. So the final step to get the basic slicer working is to head back to the report view, and then select the slicer and remove the genre field from it, and then go over to the data panel, choose the genre picker table, and add the genre field from that into the slicer. So now we've got the ability to pick genres from our slicer without influencing anything else in the data model. We've got our basic disconnected slicer set up. The next step involves calculating the average runtime for the genre that I've picked from my disconnected slicer. So let's create a new measure to do that. I'm going to add a new measure to my all measures table. I'm going to call this one AVG runtime selected genre. I'm going to begin actually by just returning the value, the name of the selected genre. And I'm going to do that by using the SELECTEDVALUE function. So you may have seen this used in a previous video in this little section. I'm going to use SELECTEDVALUE and then refer very carefully to the genre field in my genre picker table. So it's really easy to mix up the original genre column with your genre picker column. So just be very careful to make sure you pick the correct one. So we know that the SELECTEDVALUE function returns the unique single selected value. It's like a bit of a shortcut to the if has one value values combination. The important thing for us is if I create that new measure and then just temporarily insert that measure into my original table visual, when I pick a genre from the list, you can see that the name of that genre appears next to every single row. So the next step is to show not the name of the genre, but the average runtime for all films belonging to the genre that I picked. So basically that means we need to manipulate the filter context of the average runtime calculation. And the best way to do that, almost certainly, is to use the calculate function. So let's head back to the measure average runtime selected genre, and then insert a calculate function to wrap around the selected value portion. So I'm going to say calculate, and I'm going to use my existing measure AVG runtime, and then I'm going to apply a filter to this by asking to show the average runtime, but only for films where the genre from the original genre table is equal to the genre I've picked from my genre picker table. So again, be very careful to make sure you picked the correct genre in each case, one from the original table and one from your genre picker table. If I update that measure now by pressing enter, and then again head back to pick a genre from my picker, we can see that whichever genre I pick now displays the average runtime for the selected genre next to every single row. Because I'd like to create a couple of measures that will compare the average runtime for each genre in the table with the average runtime for the genre that I picked. Let's first of all work out the variance from the selected genre's average runtime. So let's add a new measure to the all measures table, right click and choose new measure, and I'll call this one AVG runtime variance from selected. If you can think of better shorter names, please feel free to use them. This is no more complicated than subtracting one measure from another. So I'm going to refer to my original AVG runtime measure first, and then subtract from that the AVG runtime for the selected genre. I can enter that and insert that new measure into my table. I just need to adjust the width of my table and my slicer so I can see all of this. Let's just take the opportunity to do that. Okay, so we can see if we switch the genre we have picked, we can see a different value calculated by our measure. So it's simply subtracting this value, it's subtracting this value from this value to work out the variance. That's one fairly common way to compare two values. Another would be to perhaps work out the percentage of one value of another. So let's take the opportunity to do that as well. Let's add another new measure. I'm going to call this one AVG runtime percentage of selected. And then I'll simply make this one equal to one measure divided by another using the divide function. So I'll say divide and then use my original AVG runtime measure and then divide that by the AVG runtime for the selected genre. So having done that, if I hit enter and then I can insert that new measure into my table, we've got two ways to compare the average runtime for each genre with the one we've picked. I think before we go much further, it's worthwhile spending some time formatting the results of these measures. So first of all, maybe the average runtime percentage of selected value. Maybe that one would work better with a percentage format. So I can select that and then apply the percentage formatting to the measure itself, which of course will then update the table. For the variance from the selected value, I'd like to see any positive numbers appear with a plus symbol in front of them, negative numbers which should still have a minus symbol in front of them. There isn't a built-in format for that, but if I choose my measure, average runtime variance from selected, I can write my own custom number format in the format box in the measure tools tab of the ribbon. So let's do that. If we select the word general there, and then I'm going to replace that with a custom number format starting with a plus symbol and then 0.00. So that defines the positive portion of my number format. Then if I want to move on to the negative part of the number format, I can type in a semicolon and then say minus 0.00 to get numbers with two decimal places with a minus symbol in front of them. And if I hit enter to update that number format, we should see in the table in the background that any positive numbers now have a plus symbol in front of them. I'm also just going to modify the column names in my table. I know that I'm looking at the average runtime, so I'm just going to modify these extra columns by taking away the AVG runtime. So let's take away AVG runtime in front of selected genre, and then AVG runtime in front of variance, and then time in front of percentage of selected. And I'll just tidy things up a little bit. Okay, one final thing I'd like to do is apply some conditional formatting to change the color of the font of both the variance and the percentage of selected. So basically, wherever I end up with a positive number in the variance column, I'd like to highlight the font in one color. If it's a negative number, in a different color. I could do that by applying conditional formatting directly in the conditional formatting dialog box. I can set up a rule for the font color. But if I have to recreate that rule every single time I want to format a different column, that's going to get really annoying. So instead, let's create a measure to work out the colors we're going to use. I'm going to right click on the all measures table and choose new measure. And I'm just going to call it font color and make it equal to the result of an if function. I'm going to check if the value of the average runtime variance from selected measure is less than 0, followed by a comma. And if that's true, I want to produce a colour. You can enter colours in DAX by just writing a string, either using the name of the colour or a hexadecimal code for the colour. So for instance, I could open up some double quotes here and write the word orange, or if I happen to know the hex code for the particular shade of orange I want, I could type that in as well. I'm going to go hash E6 6C37, and I definitely haven't just read that off my notes there. I'm going to type in a comma and then produce a color for the positive numbers. Again, I could type in a number, a color like blue, or I could use a hex code, which I'm going to use this time, which is hash 11.8D. I then close the round brackets and hit enter. I can then assign that measure in the conditional formatting dialog box without having to set up the rule every single time. So I'm going to find my variance from selected field in the columns bucket in the field well, give it a right click and choose conditional formatting font color. I can change the format style to refer to a field value, and then from the drop down list below, simply select the font color measure I've just created. If I click OK, we'll see the font colors change in that column, and then I can just do exactly the same thing for the percentage of selected column. Right click, conditional formatting, font color, and then choose to use a field value and use my font color measure. Click OK again, and there's a reasonably nicely formatted table. I'm sure you could go much further and create a much better format than that, but the important thing is that the conditional formatting works appropriately when we select different genres in the list. So the system's working reasonably well at the moment. We can select different genres and see the comparison to the one we've picked appearing in the final two columns of our table. The problem I've got at the moment, though, is that if I don't have any genre selected, we don't get a value for the average runtime of the selected genre, so the other columns look a little bit odd, to put it politely. Maybe we could change our measure so that if we don't have a genre selected, the value for the average runtime for the selected genre simply picks the unfiltered value, so the one that sits at the bottom of the average runtime column there. That's the average runtime for all films, regardless of which genre they belong to, i.e. it's the average runtime with no genre filter applied to it. So let's modify the average runtime selected genre measure to do that. I only want to perform this calculation if I have picked a value, i.e. I have filtered the genre column of my genre picker table. So let's add a basic conditional statement to do that. First of all, I'm going to take my calculate function down a couple of lines, and then maybe just add an if function to the beginning of my calculation, say equals if. On the next line, I'm going to ask is filtered, and then I'm going to reference the genre column of my genre picker table. If that's true, if I just enter a comma at the end of that, if that's true, I want to perform this calculation. I want to calculate the average runtime where the genre is equal to the name of the one that I've picked. At the end of that, I can type in another comma. And if that wasn't true, I want to perform a different calculation. I'll calculate the average runtime, but this time I'm going to do this by removing all filters. Say remove filters. I don't really need to remove all filters. If I wanted to be specific, I could just remove the filter applied by the genre column in the original genre table. That's the one that's influencing the results of my measure here. So let's be as specific as we can then. Let's say genre, and then close the round brackets for that calculate function and close one more set of round brackets for the if function. So nice to have the red highlighting there to indicate I haven't yet closed all the brackets I need. Okay, so if I hit enter at this point, we will hopefully see when I don't have any genre picked in my disconnected slicer, the value of the average runtime for my selected genre matches the unfiltered version of that. And therefore I can get a comparison for every genre, regardless of whether I pick anything or not. The next problem I think we want to solve is what happens if the user decides to pick more than one genre at the same time. So I've got the action genre selected at the moment. If I hold down the control key, I can click on as many other genres as I like to add them to the selection. And again, we end up with this slightly odd looking table where we haven't got a value calculated for the average runtime of the selected genre. That's of course down to the function that we used to return the value that we picked from our genre picker. We used the SELECTEDVALUE function. And again, if you remember from a couple of videos ago, SELECTEDVALUE returns a single value when one is selected and blank otherwise. You can add an alternate result to that if you wanted to, so I could add a comma and specify the alternate result if more than one item's been selected, but that doesn't really help in this case. What we could do, one possible solution to this, would involve testing not if the genre of a film is equal to the single one that we've selected, but test whether the genre of a film is in the list of values that I've selected. So a couple of quick simple changes to our average runtime selected genre measure. First of all, we'll change the equals operator to an in, and then we'll change the SELECTEDVALUE function to the values function. So that's the same function we used to generate our genre picker table in the first place. It returns a list of unique values from the table or column you referenced. And of course, if I've selected only 3 genres, it will return only the 3 that I picked. So having done that, if I update that measure, we should see in the background that no matter how many genres I pick, the average runtime for those selected genres is calculated. So that's a combination average runtime of all the genres I picked. And I can go down to a single genre and select just that one and get that correct result. I can choose no genres at all and get the unfiltered version of average runtime, or I can pick as many as I want. So the system is working under any circumstances at this point. As an alternative approach, we could limit our slicer to only allowing a single selection in the first place, and then we wouldn't have had the problem with having to compare with multiple selections. Let's have a quick look at what happens when we do that. I'm going to select my genre slicer, head to the Format pane, and then in the Slicer Settings Selection section, simply enable the Single Select option. So you'll see that having done that, I now always have to have one and only one option picked. So therefore I don't need to test, first of all, if the genre picker genre column is filtered, because it always will be. And I don't need to test if the value I've selected is in, or sorry, the genre for each film is in the list of items I've selected, because I can only select one. So that means we could go back to the average runtime selected genre and make this measure a lot simpler. What I'm going to do is get rid of the calculate function that calculates the unfiltered version. I'll never be able to have an unfiltered version because I must always have one genre selected. I'm going to modify this calculation to check when it's equal to selected value rather than the values. And then I'm going to take away the test to see if the genre picker genre column is filtered, because I know that it always must be, because I always must have an item selected in that slicer. So a much simpler, cleaner measure at that point. And if I hit enter to update it, we should see that everything now behaves once again quite normally. So at this point, we have lost the ability to compare each genre with the unfiltered version of the average runtime. And what if we wanted to bring that option back? If we're leaving our slicer set up as a single select slicer, we always have to have one option selected. So what we need to do is add an option into this list, which allows us to select all genres. There are several ways we could do this. What we're going to do is add an option to the list of genres in the genre picker table. So we're going to modify the formula that we used to create that table in the first place. Let's select the table to bring back the formula we used to create it. I want to take the full list of genres from the genre table, which is what the values function is already doing, so that's fine. But I want to append to that list a value called all. When you want to append lists of values together, One function you can use to do that in DAX is called union. People familiar with SQL will be familiar with union queries, and it's fundamentally the same thing. So we're going to say union, open some round brackets, and then you simply provide a list of tables you want to append together. So we've already got one, which is the result of the values function. Let's type in a comma there, and then we'll populate this with a new set of values. Now, I only want to insert the literal text, all. But if I just try to type in the word all in some double quotes there, that's not a table. It's just a bit of text. It's a simple scalar value, and the union function requires a list of tables. So there's a couple of ways we can make this be treated as a table. A simple way is to wrap it up in a set of curly brackets or braces. So that's the row indicator or row delimiter that indicates the value I've typed in there belongs to a row of values that should be appended to the table. If you want to do this in a slightly more formal way, rather than just wrapping the value in curly brackets, you could use a function called row, and then use round brackets to indicate the name of the column you're creating. So I'm going to refer to this as genre, followed by a comma, and then the value you want to assign to that column. That allows you to create lots and lots of columns in the same row, so you can put in a name and value pair for each value you want to add in. Of course, in this case, there's only one column to populate, which is genre. So those two options are available. If I hit enter to update my genre picker table, we should see that we've now got an all option sitting in the list. I find it a little bit annoying that that's sitting there alphabetically listed and not where I think I would want it, sitting right at the top of the list. I've got a couple of options for how we could make it float to the top of the list. We could get into some complicated stuff and add a new column to our genre picker table with, say, a value that indicates the sort order, and make sure that the all option has the lowest value in that column. That seems like a lot of effort to me, so I'm going to take a slightly more pragmatic approach. I'm going to simply wrap a set of round brackets around the word all inside the formula that generates this table. Because these values are sorted alphabetically and punctuation characters like parentheses are sorted before letters, if I simply update my formula now, have a look, the all option is sitting right at the top of the slicer. So we've successfully added the all option to our slicer. The problem we have now, of course, is that the measures we've created don't respond to the selection of that option. If we have a look back at the average runtime selected genre measure, we've gone back to checking only if the genre of the film is equal to the value of the genre that I picked. And no films, of course, have a genre called all assigned to them. So we'll need to modify this measure again. I'm going to add an if function to the beginning. I'm going to say if, use SELECTEDVALUE to return the value of my genre picker genre, and check if that is equal to the text all contained in some round brackets, followed by a comma. So if that condition is true, if I've picked all, I basically want to return the unfiltered version of the average runtime. So let's recreate the calculate function that calculates the AVG runtime, removing filters from the genre column. Those are round brackets for that calculate function, stick in another comma. Assuming that I haven't selected all, then I can go back and successfully calculate the average runtime for the genre that I picked, and then close the final set of round brackets for the if function again, and then when I hit enter, we'll now once again be able to select all, which gives me the unfiltered version of average runtime, or the average runtime for a single genre that I pick. I think the main thing that I'm unhappy with this example is displaying the value for the average runtime of the selected genre in the table. I think that looks a little bit messy. It's pointless showing it next to every single row. I'd like to maybe incorporate that value in a dynamic table title. So let's create a measure to generate that title. I'm going to start simply, I'm going to add a new measure. I'm going to call this one table title. And I'm going to simply concatenate the text average runtime versus, and then I just want the value of my selected genre picker genre column. So I'm going to say ampersand and then maybe throw a new line and say selected value genre picker genre. Maybe I'll add a little bit of extra text to the end of that. So I'll concatenate that with the text movies, close the double quotes and then hit enter. If I select my table then and head over to the Format Your Visual panel, hit the General category and enable a title for my table, I can then expand that section and use the conditional formatting button to assign my table title measure to the title. I can then click OK, and there's my title. Let's bump up the font size, or maybe change the font itself. Let's go for Seco UI Bold, and then make it a little bit bigger. There we go. So it says at the moment average runtime versus all movies, and then I can select the action genre, and it's say action movies, adventure movies. So whichever genre I pick, my title responds to that. I'd like to include the actual value of the average runtime for the selected genre, maybe in some round brackets after the word movies. So to do that, let's head back to the table title measure. And then at the end of the word movies, I'm going to insert an open parenthesis, and then another ampersand at the end of that. And then I can refer to my AVG runtime selected genre measure, and then concatenate the closing parenthesis at the end. So if I hit enter and then have a look at the results, it's getting there. At least I've got the number. It's just a bit of a shame that the number isn't formatted particularly nicely. Obviously, when we see that value stored in the table, it is formatted according to the formatting properties assigned. So if I have my average runtime selected genre measure selected there, I could choose, I don't really need to because it's already done automatically, I could choose decimal number and then set it to 2 decimal places. It's already doing that automatically. If I change the genre I've picked now in the slicer, sadly you'll see that our measure, our dynamic title, doesn't respond to that formatting. So if I want the nicely formatted version of that, I've got to calculate that nicely formatted version in the table title measure. So rather than just saying average runtime selected genre, I'm going to wrap the format function around that. So format open brackets. This is the value I want to format, followed by a comma, and then in some double quotes, we can type in the types of custom number formats we'll be using to control the values of this column. So I'm just going to go for 0.00, which will format the number to 2 decimal places, close the round brackets there and press enter, and then this time the results will look a little bit neater. Oops, apologies. Let's see, so if I select different genres, we'll see that that remains formatted to 2 decimal places. The only one that I'm not particularly happy with is when I select all, the all example contains the open and close round brackets around it, which is a bit annoying. So we've got several ways we could handle that. I guess we could use a simple if function to check if we've selected the all option with round brackets, and if so, concatenate the word all without round brackets. Or maybe we could just use a couple of functions to remove the round brackets and replace them with empty strings. This is probably getting a little bit too complicated, but it's nice to see how far we can go with this. I'm going to head back to my table title measure, and then rather than just using the selected value of genre picker genre, we're going to substitute any open brackets and any closed brackets in that text with empty strings. So I'm going to wrap a substitute function around the selected value function. And I think I'll probably break this onto multiple lines here to make it a little bit easier to read. So I'm going to substitute within the selected value genre. I'm going to look for any open round brackets. So open round brackets in double quotes, followed by a comma. Replace those with an empty string, so double quotes with nothing in between. If I then close the round brackets for that substitute function and I hit enter, we should then see that the open round bracket in front of the word all has indeed disappeared. Now I just need to do the same thing to get rid of the closed round bracket. So I can go back to my table title and I can wrap another substitute function around this first one. So let's say substitute, and then take that one down to the next line. Just to help me out, I'm going to indent all of this text so I can see that the start and end of each of my individual substitute functions. So once I've substituted the open round bracket, I'd then like to substitute the closing round bracket. And then I want to substitute that with another empty string, and then close the round brackets, and there we go. That is definitely overkill in my book, but just in case you wanted to go to such extreme lengths, you can create some quite nicely formatted dynamic titles. And there we go, you can see the whole system working. To finish the video, it's just worthwhile quickly mentioning that you're not limited to using this sort of technique in tables. You can use the same technique in any sort of visual. So maybe let's right-click on page 1 and duplicate the page. And then I'm going to take my table visual. I'm going to take away the original average runtime, selected genre, variance from selected. No, actually, beg pardon, I'll leave variance from selected in. I'll take away percentage of selected. And then I'm going to convert this table visual into a simple column chart. There we go. I think I'd like to have that column chart sorted alphabetically by genre. So I'm going to head up to the More Options menu of the chart, choose Sort Axis Genre, and then Sort. And then I'm going to assign the same measure that calculated our font colors in our table to the column colors of my chart. So I'm going to go to my Format Visual panel, head to the Columns category, and click the Conditional Formatting button next to the color property. Once again, rather than setting up another manual rule, I can choose to use a field value and then use that font color measure that I created. So anything falling below 0 goes orange, anything 0 or more stays blue. And now we can select different genres from our slicer and see how each other genre compares in the form of a chart instead of a table. So there we go. There's a quick summary of using basic disconnected slicers, not to filter visuals in your page, but to affect the values passed into measures. You can then, in your DAX code, make use of that value in whatever way you like. Hope you've enjoyed that one. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.